Imagine a facility designed by the world's most cynical architects, a $100 million fortress of concrete, steel, and razor wire, staffed by 300 armed guards whose entire existence is dedicated to making sure you never see a sunset again. Now, imagine a man walking out of that fortress without firing a single shot, without scaling a fence, and without digging a tunnel. He didn't break the system. He used the system to export himself. On April 5, 2006, Richard Lee McNair became the only person in history to mail himself out of a federal maximum security prison. People think prisons are about locks and keys, but the truth is, they're about routines. And Richard McNair was a master of the routine. He spent years becoming a ghost in the machine, a model prisoner who was so polite, so helpful, and so predictable that the guards literally loaded him onto a truck and drove him to freedom. This is a story of a $19 million manhunt, a conversation with a cop that should have ended in a shootout, and the 3,000-mile journey of a man who'd proved that if you can talk your way into a room, you can talk your way out of a life sentence. Richard Lee McNair wasn't your typical stone-cold killer. He was a sergeant in the United States Air Force. He was intelligent, well-spoken, and had a smile that made people feel safe. But by night, he was a shadow. He spent his off-duty hours burglarizing businesses across North Dakota, hitting grain elevators and offices for quick cash. He was good at it until February 1987. McNair broke into a grain warehouse in Manhunt, thinking it was empty. It wasn't. He was surprised by two men, a security guard and a truck driver named Jerry Thice. In the sudden, violent friction of that moment, the polite sergeant vanished, and a killer emerged. McNair opened fire. The guard lived, but Jerry Thice didn't. McNair was caught within days, and the judge handed down 2 life sentences plus 30 years. At 47 years old, the math was simple. McNair was going to die in a cage, but he had other plans.
You have to understand the psychology of a man like McNair. He didn't just want to escape, he wanted to win. His first attempt happened almost immediately after his arrest in 1988. He was sitting in a police station, handcuffed to a chair, waiting for a transfer. Most men would be sobbing or praying. McNair was looking at his pockets. He had a small container of lip balm. While the detective stepped out for a cup of coffee, McNair didn't try to pick the lock. He used the lip balm as a lubricant, slathering it over his wrists until his skin was slick. He twisted, he pulled, and he let the cold steel of the handcuffs grate against his bone until his hands slipped through. He didn't walk out the door. He went for the 3rd-story window. 3 stories, 30 feet down to solid concrete. He jumped, hit the ground, felt the bones in his feet scream, and he kept running. He was caught later that day, hobbling through town, but that failure was his first lesson. He realized that speed was a gimmick, but patience was a weapon. Fast forward 4 years to the North Dakota State Penitentiary. McNair and 2 other inmates spent weeks scraping away at a ventilation duct with nothing but smuggled scraps of metal. They moved decades-old concrete, ounce by ounce, under the cover of the night. In the middle of a sub-zero North Dakota winter, they crawled through the ducts, onto the roof, and into the darkness. McNair stayed free for 10 months that time. He traveled the country, changed his walk, grew a beard, and lived as a ghost. He was finally caught in Nebraska, not because he made a mistake, but because someone recognized his face from a poster. This earned him a one-way ticket to ADX Florence, the Alcatraz of the Rockies. This is where they keep the Unabomber and the 9/11 conspirators. It's a place where hope goes to die in a 4-by-7-foot concrete box.
McNair knew he couldn't break out of ADX. The security wasn't human, it was architectural. So he started his longest con yet. For years, he played the part of the reformed man. He read books, he took classes, and he spoke softly to the prison psychologists. He convinced them that the fire had gone out. He acted so well that they eventually downgraded his security risk and transferred him to USP Pollock in Louisiana. To the authorities, Pollock was a secure federal site. To McNair,
It was a playground. He immediately volunteered for the prison's manufacturing program, specifically the unit that repaired old mailbags for the U.S. Postal Service. He spent months sewing canvas, but his eyes were never on the needle. They were on the pallets. He noticed that repaired bags were stacked onto wooden pallets, wrapped in layers of heavy plastic shrink wrap, and moved by forklift to a warehouse outside the main perimeter fence. That warehouse was the blind spot. If he could get into a pallet, he was already halfway to the woods. The preparation was surgical. He needed a pod, a hollow space in the center of the mailbags where he could sit without the pallet collapsing and crushing his ribs. He spent weeks measuring the dimensions of the bags with his eyes. He smuggled a thin plastic tube from the workshop to act as a snorkel, because once that shrink wrap went on, the pallet became an airtight tomb. He stole a razor blade and taped it to his inner thigh. He even managed to secure a set of civilian clothes, running shorts and a tank top, which he wore under his prison greens every single day, waiting for the right moment. That moment came on the morning of April 5th, 2006.
The air in the workshop smelled of old canvas and industrial oil. It was 11 a.m., the shift change before lunch. The guards were focused on the head count in the cafeteria. McNair stayed behind, telling a supervisor he wanted to finish one last stack. As soon as he was alone, he stripped off his prison uniform, stuffed it behind a workbench, and climbed into his pre-constructed hollow in the pallet. He pulled the mailbags over his head, curled into a fetal position, and put the breathing tube in his mouth. Then he heard the sound that would haunt his dreams, the low growl of a forklift engine. The fork slid under the pallet with a metallic clang. McNair felt himself lift off the ground. He was a 200-pound man hidden inside a stack of mail, and if the forklift driver noticed the weight was off, or if a guard saw the breathing tube poking out like a blade of grass, it was over. The forklift moved across the yard, bouncing over the uneven concrete. Every jolt sent a shockwave through McNair's spine. He could hear the guards talking, the sound of the wind, the heavy gates sliding open. He was being driven right past the armed towers. The forklift dropped the pallet in a warehouse outside the fence, and the driver drove away. McNair sat in total darkness, buried under hundreds of pounds of canvas, breathing through a straw. He waited. He waited for the warehouse workers to go to lunch. He waited for the silence to become absolute. When the only sound left was his own heartbeat, he reached for the razor blade. He sliced through the plastic like a surgeon, pushed aside the bags, and stepped out onto the warehouse floor. He wasn't in a cell anymore. He was outside. He walked to the loading dock, looked at the Louisiana sun for the first time in years, and started to run.
But this is where the story goes from a prison break to a legend. 2 hours after his escape, McNair was jogging down a railroad track in the town of Ball, Louisiana. He was sweaty, he was wearing running gear, and he looked like any other middle-aged guy trying to lose a few pounds. That's when a patrol car pulled up. Officer Carl Bordelon had just heard the alert. An inmate had escaped from Pollock. He saw a man matching the description and pulled him over. This should have been the end of the story. Bordelon was a veteran cop, and McNair was a wanted murderer. But McNair didn't run. He didn't reach for a weapon. He stopped, wiped the sweat from his forehead, and smiled. For 10 minutes, the two men stood there talking. McNair told the officer his name was Robert Jones, a construction worker in town to help with the Hurricane Katrina rebuild. He was calm. He was charming. He even joked about the heat. When Bordelon pointed out that he matched the description of the escapee, McNair laughed it off. He even gave the officer 2 different names, Robert Jones and then Jimmy, a mistake that should have been a massive red flag. But McNair's confidence was a force of nature. He looked the cop in the eye and projected such a sense of normalcy that Bordelon's instincts were overridden. The officer actually told him to be careful and let him go. McNair didn't bolt. He continued jogging at a steady pace until the patrol car was out of sight. It is arguably the most incredible display of social engineering in criminal history. Within 2 hours, Bordelon realized his mistake, but by then, McNair was a ghost in the Louisiana woods.
The manhunt that followed was a multi-million-dollar embarrassment for the federal government. The U.S. Marshals put McNair on the top 15 most wanted list. His face was on every television screen from New Orleans to New York. But McNair was ahead of them. He knew that staying in the U.S. was a death sentence, so he headed north. He didn't just cross the border into Canada. he disappeared into it. For 18 months, McNair lived a life that sounded more like a survivalist movie than a fugitive's run. He stole cars when he had to, but he was careful. He never used violence. He stole a bicycle and rode it over 1,000 miles through the rugged terrain of the Yukon. Imagine that, a convicted killer, one of the most wanted men in America, pedaling a mountain bike through the Canadian wilderness, stopping at ranger stations for coffee. He was a master of the selfie before the word even existed. When the police eventually found one of his stolen cars, they discovered a digital camera. On it were photos of McNair in different disguises, standing in front of famous Canadian landmarks, smiling at the camera as if he were on a summer vacation. He was taunting the world. He lived in motels, worked odd jobs for cash, and even spent time in a remote cabin in British Columbia. He watched the news, saw his own face on America's Most Wanted, and used that information to stay one step ahead of the marshals. He was learning their tactics in real time. If they said they were checking border crossings in the east, he moved west. If they mentioned he might be using a certain alias, he burned it and created a new one.
But the thing about being a fugitive is that you have to be right every single second of every single day. The police only have to be lucky once. In October 2007, McNair was driving a stolen van through rural New Brunswick. He wasn't speeding, he wasn't breaking any laws, but he ran into a random police checkpoint. This wasn't a high-stakes sting operation, it was a routine stop to check for drunk drivers. When the Canadian officers asked for his ID, McNair's luck finally hit a wall. The name on the license didn't match the registration of the van. The officers grew suspicious. They didn't know they had Richard McNair, but they knew they had someone who was lying. They brought him in for fingerprinting, and within minutes, the red light started flashing in every law enforcement database in North America. The 18-month odyssey was over. McNair didn't fight when they cuffed him. He was tired. He had lived more life in those 18 months than most people do in 80 years. He had proven his point. He had escaped from a city jail, a state prison, and a federal maximum security facility, the triple crown of prison breaks. No one else has ever done it. When he was extradited back to the United States, he was greeted by U.S. Marshals who, despite themselves, felt a grudging respect for the man. One marshal later admitted that they had exchanged letters with McNair after his capture. McNair joked that if he'd just worn his seatbelt that day in New Brunswick, he'd probably be sitting on a beach in Mexico.
Today, Richard McNair is back where he started, ADX Florence. He spends 23 hours a day in a concrete box under the most intense surveillance on the planet. There are no mailbags to repair at ADX. There are no pallets. There is only the sound of the heavy steel door and the humming of the fluorescent lights. The system he embarrassed has made sure that there will be no fourth escape. They've closed the mailbag programs, they've overhauled the shipping protocols, and they've turned McNair's case into a mandatory training module for every federal prison guard in the country. He is the reason your local prison has extra sensors on its loading docks. But even now, in his mid-60s, McNair hasn't stopped being McNair. He paces his cell 23 steps from the wall to the door, 23 steps back. He's counting, he's observing, he's waiting. Because the lesson of Richard McNair isn't that prisons are weak. It's that no system is more powerful than a man with infinite patience and nothing left to lose. He showed the world that a cage is only as strong as the routine of the man holding the key. And while the government might have the last word, McNair has the memories of those 18 months in the Yukon, where for a brief moment, a killer was just a man on a bicycle, watching the northern lights and knowing that for a little while, he was the only person in the world who was truly free. If you ever find yourself thinking that a problem is impossible to solve, remember the man in the mailbag. He didn't have tools, he didn't have a map, and he didn't have help. He only had a straw, a razor blade, and the audacity to believe he could ship himself to a new life. It makes you wonder, what systems are you trapped in right now? And what routine are you ignoring that could be your way out? But before you start looking for a pallet and some shrink wrap, you might want to check out our next video. It's about a group of men who took a very different approach to a high security problem, one that involved a helicopter.
and a very daring rooftop landing. You won't want to miss it.